I'd like to introduce the person leading us through this morning's session, Margie Reese. Margie Johnson Reese has a 30-year profile as an arts advocate and arts management professional. Margie served a 6-year term as director of the Office of Cultural Affairs for the city of Dallas. After her time there, she relocated to Los Angeles to serve as the general manager for the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs. Returning to Texas, Margie most recently developed the Wichita Falls Arts Council as a new arts service organization that services a multi-county region that includes both urban and rural communities. Margie has been a friend to the Nebraska Arts Council for longer than either she or I would care to admit. And I'm so glad that our regional arts organization, Mid-America Arts Alliance, has engaged Margie as an equity and inclusion consultant for our region, and more specifically for us. So welcome, Margie, and you're ready to go.
Thank you, Suzanne. Good morning, Nebraska. I'm so excited to be with you virtually. I am dialing in from Atlanta, Georgia, where it is just about as humid as you can imagine. I am an African-American woman. My hair all of a sudden is almost completely silver. I'm a grandmother now, so that brings me even greater joy. And I want to talk with you this morning, and I hope you will share questions and ideas as we go through. I want to talk with you about inclusion, and to help us together think about what we mean by that as we work in the field of arts and culture. There are so many new definitions. I'm sure that you're being faced with having to decode and try to understand what it means. What does it mean to your organization's programming, to volunteer recruitment, to community engagement, and to board leadership development? So let's talk about that a little bit today. And I'm really happy to have the help from somebody at the Nebraska Arts Council who's going to be moving my slides for me so that I don't really reveal my ineptness at this process. So let's go on to the first slide. So what does inclusive programming mean to your organization? And I'm thinking that this slide deck can be made available to you later, or certainly I see that it's being recorded. And so I just want to note that on each of these slides, there's a phrase or a few words from a series of songs. I like to think about our work now helping us advance these thoughts by listening to music. And so I put in a series of songs at the end of each of the slides that I would welcome your going back when you have some relaxed time. But this first slide is anchored by the words of India Ari in a song, What If? And it's right now, this is our moment. And the operative word there is our. It's not your moment. It's our moment as a community of arts administrators, as a community of people that care about the arts. So let's talk about inclusion and thinking out loud a little bit about what the definition of that is. Sorry, my second deck. So inclusion is, first of all, anchored in the idea that to be included as a human being is a right, a human right. And the idea of inclusion here is to embrace all people. We're talking about inclusion across the spectrum of age, so children, adults, elders, across racial and cultural demographic lines. We're talking about inclusion of people with different abilities, both economic abilities, physical abilities, and mental abilities. In the field right now, we seem to be leaning into conversations about racial inclusion and racial equity, certainly a high level concern for all of us. And so some of our conversation will focus a little bit on that In the panel that follows this discussion, you'll also hear about other areas of work that are looking to include people with different abilities as well. So when we think about your programming and how to bring more diverse programming into your communities, how to make sure that the broadest audience possible is included in the programming design, that's a centerpiece that we want to focus on. As Suzanne said, I'm working in Wichita Falls, Texas, and our service area includes some very small, all-white rural communities, mostly occupied by folks who've been in the ranching and farming business all their lives. They have limited travel outside of their geographic areas, even coming in to 100, 150 miles into Wichita Falls, which is a small but metropolitan area. So we see a lot of isolated communities, geographically isolated communities, but there's no shortage of cultural interest and richness. So even in the ranching communities, there's a richness that we want to bring outside of those communities, to share with a broader audience. And those opportunities are few and far between. I've had individuals in leadership positions in those neighborhoods say, we don't do arts. We're not cultured. Our children need to see some of these other activities, but we can't get them there. Transportation is a problem. And certainly artists on tour right now, there are limitations to artists being able to physically go into smaller communities, but we'll get back to a time and place when we can travel. And so it's still important to think about how we identify opportunities in our programming efforts to make sure that we're being more inclusive. Let's go to the next slide. And the bottom line in this particular part of the conversation is the idea of being adaptive, and that planning for inclusion does require resources. It's not something that will happen overnight. It may take you 2 to 3 years to redesign or to design your program planning, your audience development planning to achieve your inclusion goals. But the bottom line here is that we've got to think about resources, and we have to have a game plan. Otherwise, it won't work. You'll end up with a one-off situation where there is no leave behind and no track record of how the success was managed, what failures you encountered, and what we need to look at going forward. So I would say the first note to circle in this conversation is about being adaptive and about planning for change by including resources, not just dollars and cents, although money is important in everything we do, but from a human resource perspective. How are you engaging volunteers? How is your board engaged in a conversation about broadening participation? And human resource planning is a huge effort, and it's often overlooked when we think about inclusion. I see a lot of organizations identifying a staff person, whether it's a staff person of color or a staff person who focuses on education, who focuses on public relations, to be the person to think about inclusion. My advice to you in this regard is that the road to successful inclusion planning must involve everyone in your organization, in the conversations, in the thinking about what are the barriers, how do we move through this process in a sequential way. I think that idea about including a larger membership of your staff team is very important. So being adaptive and thinking about resource planning. Next slide. We want to talk about this idea of who you're wanting to bring into your organization, or how you're wanting to address the broad conversation about inclusion. And I would say to you to think about who are you extending the invitation to? And more importantly, why are you extending this invitation? So here's a time when we think about the words in this song, Can't Nobody Tell Me Nothing. As arts administrators and leaders of arts organizations, sometimes we think we know our communities. Can't nobody tell me nothing. I already know who's out there. I know who's not coming. I know why they're not coming. But my advice on this note is to think about gaining more background knowledge about your community, not just the data. I'm not an anti-data person, but not just the numbers, but the stories, the experiences, and the ideas of the communities that you're wanting to engage with. Building that background knowledge goes back to our first point about involving everyone in the organization. Now, I have been involved in the arts for a very long time. And I know that we get caught up in producing our program, putting on the show, getting the exhibitions booked and mounted, et cetera. And audience development falls to the bottom of our to-do list. We need to move that up a little bit higher because people need to tell us before we start planning the show, planning for the event that we want to engage a broader community in, we really need to stop and take the time to talk to our audiences. So we're talking about here is inclusion by design, not as an accident or an afterthought, as a planned, programmed, pre-designed process. Who are you extending the invitation to and why? And the why question is really important, my friends. Is it Latino Heritage Month and we need to make sure that the programming that we've planned reaches the audience, the desired audience? Is it African American Heritage Month? Are we trying to celebrate Juneteenth? Is it Native American or First American Heritage Month? You know, those are legitimate times of celebration, but there are 365 days of programming that your organization is thinking about. And so inclusion should be an ongoing conversation so that you're not extending the invitation to an audience for a one-shot deal. I think it's important to get outside of your offices, maybe broaden your Zoom audiences, and actually talk to people about what's important to them as it relates to cultural expression and engaging culture. We want to change our blocked minds from I already know why they are not coming, that nobody can't tell me anything idea, to having some background knowledge, transportation, time of day. And you know, with many audiences that we're wanting to recruit, money is not the issue. It's desire and interest. And so we want to be cautious of always reverting to that idea that we're going to offer them free tickets and extend the invitation. And you will probably have your own stories about this free ticket idea. But just because something is offered to you free doesn't mean that people have to respond. And often we're going to be disappointed. We'll talk more about that later. Next slide. So the bottom line here of all I'm trying to say is that engaging with new audiences in a collaborative planning way is the direction that you want to go. That's the bottom line. If I sit in my office and plan the most brilliant and amazing program, I'm going to be disappointed if that work has not been done with the knowledge and input from the audiences that you're wanting to reach. Next slide. So here's the idea of creating a welcoming environment. And I think to some extent, the welcome environment might be easier to accomplish than an inclusive environment. So getting the messages across that you are both welcome to be included in the conversations as we're planning and as we're implementing programming. And indeed, there are hills and mountains between us. We might live next door to each other, but my lived experiences are certainly going to be different than my neighbors, no matter what their abilities or their capabilities are. And I want to tell you a little story here. I hope I can do it quickly. It's a story about inclusion that I experienced as a 17 or 18-year-old when I was in college in Washington State, coming to Washington State from Louisiana. I'd never been on an airplane before, but when I got to Washington State for college, I found a very welcoming environment. There were staff people there and student assistants there to help me get settled, etc. And so I fast track with you on the story to Thanksgiving, where I was invited to spend Thanksgiving holiday with a young woman in the dorm that I had befriended. Her family had not had much encounter, if any, with African Americans. But I get to her home for Thanksgiving, and her mother has created the most welcoming bedroom for me to sleep in, books on the desk, a soft lounge chair for me to sit in at the end of the day. And so I settled into the room and went downstairs to join the family. I could hear the laughter and the cheering from the kitchen. And I got downstairs and I was greeted very warmly. People were shaking my hand and hugging me. These are the days when you could do that. And I recalled what my mother would say to me: when someone invites you to their home, roll up your sleeves and offer to help. I offered to help in 3 or 4 different situations and was always told, oh no, you're a guest, you just relax. So then I would hear the cheering and the laughter coming from the conversations of the family members. And as I approached them, the conversations would stop and people would turn to me and say, oh, hi, Margie, how are you? I began to feel very distant from the group that had welcomed me. And so the bottom line of that story is, and it can go on for an hour, I was welcome, but I was not included. There was nothing for me to do, to share, to be a part of. I was a guest. And the message that was coming across to me during that time was that there was such a gap in the way I expected to experience this environment and the way my host expected to have that experience. I was to sit on the side and watch. And you can imagine the conflict when you invite audiences into your organizations and to your programming, when they have no opportunity to participate in the conversation. They're just to sit and take it in. It's a very uncomfortable situation. So think about this idea of a welcoming environment versus an inclusive environment. And how are you getting yourself ready to engage with new audiences? And what messages are your actions sending? Extending the idea that there are still hills and mountains between us and we're in the same space. Next slide. These assumptions that we're making by inviting, welcoming, positioning ourselves as the all-knowing cultural organization or presenter, making assumptions that people should be eager to participate in our programming will disappoint you, just as I was disappointed that I didn't understand the language and the landscape and the energy in the room in that home that I was invited into, but neither did my host. And so they were disappointed as well. That's the bottom line. Next slide. And so then how do we make the approach? These words You give your hand to me. Some of you will recognize these as a Ray Charles tune. And then you say hello. I'm just suggesting here that sometimes it's important for us to say hello to audiences before we're reaching out to invite them into our theaters and our exhibition halls. And how do you do that? Who are the leaders in the communities that you're wanting to approach? Who are the educators in those communities? Who are the business entrepreneurs in communities? Not just in the service industries, but also in the entrepreneurial sectors. Businesses do a really good job of marketing and selling. I suggest that we can take some lessons from them, both good and bad. But the bottom line here is, again, back to that planning idea. Inclusion takes work. It takes approaching people that you don't know, that you might be afraid. I don't know what to say. I have folks say that to me all the time. I don't know what they want to be called, so I don't approach them. People want to be respected and they want their dignity to be intact after the conversation has happened. And there is nothing wrong with saying hello. I shared with you that I have a couple of grandchildren, and my 5-year-old's approach at the playground, I've watched him all summer. His approach is, "Hi, my name is Reggie." And then his question is, "How old are you?" Well, that's probably not an appropriate question. But going to talk to the minister in the community church that you're trying to approach. The musicians in churches are overlooked resources. They've all encountered massive groups of people who are interested in the performing arts, I say. And so a music teacher in a school has an idea about what her students and their families are thinking and how they're interested in being involved. So I think the number one approach here, and the idea to circle here, is saying hello to people that you don't know, but you're interested and curious and involving in your organization. I also hear in my community in Wichita Falls, they don't volunteer. And, we can talk about the they word, and you understand that that's, kind of putting people in a certain bracket. But people will become engaged and involved in the things that they're interested in doing. And if you really take a look and analyze how communities of color are organized, how homeschool parents organize the structures of interacting with other homeschool families, if you think about how children who are differently abled are grouped together with children and families that are working toward the same goals, you'll see that in every single situation, people are willing to give their time and effort to advance the cause. And so saying hello and learning about those structures will also help you think about planning and think about the approach to inviting people into your community. And not just for the volunteering, but for thinking about bringing different kinds of cultural programs into your communities. Whereas my friends in small town Seymour, Texas, a town of about 1,500 people, with a migrant population of people from South America and Mexico coming through their community a couple times a year. What they said to me was, we have these large influxes of people. This is an exclusively white community that I'm describing to you. But we want to get involved, and we want our children to understand about the culture of families that are coming in and moving out of our community. And they hosted a group of mariachi divas, all women mariachis. They hosted them as far back 2 or 3 years ago, and every single year, inviting again that group to come through, turned out to not just have an effect on the migrant families, but on the resident family who was misunderstanding the culture of people from Mexico and Southern American communities. They had biases, but over that time, the dinners that they've shared together, the cultural celebrations, infusing that work into their school curriculum, listening to music on the sidewalks, playing it in downtown Seymour, has begun to make a shift in the way people understand different cultures. And so the saying hello in that case allowed them to talk to each other about what's missing, what do our children need more of, as we think about children going out from this community into colleges, universities, workplaces across the state or across the country, where there will be a more diverse community than they have grown up around. Let's go to the next slide. And so the bottom line here is there can be no special guests. You can't arrange the pillows, the books, the linen. You can't arrange everything so that people still feel isolated and different from when you're thinking about inclusive programming. If we're not all experiencing with some sense of equity, the cultural activity that you're planning, not only will I feel special and uncomfortable, but I will not come back because I want to be included and a part of the full experience that you've planned for me. And please don't set aside special seats for me or put me in a special section of the audience or shine a light and put the microphone in front of me or take photographs of me so you can prove that I was there. I don't want to be a special guest. I want to be included just like anyone else that you're thinking about. And back to the programming part of this conversation. Again, it's appropriate to present artists that focus, whose heritage is focused on different times of the year, February, May, November, etc. But again, if you have 365 days, 52 weekends to do programming for your community and your audiences, think beyond those special days. Black History Month is a part of our culture. We're going to do special things during that time. But what's happening in the rest of the year when African-American artists who focus on the design in the design world, African-American architects that are part of a celebration of a community's, centennial birthday celebration. So think about artists whose work connects with the evolution of your community, not because of their color or their culture, but because of the contributions they've made as creative people. And it's never going to be my advice to ignore the fact that there are people of color, but to celebrate the fact that they add to the conversation and the celebration because of their skill level or their talent or the unique contributions they make to the arts world. The bottom line here is there can be no special guests. You must think about presenting artists and or including new audiences 365 days a year. Next slide. You think you know me well. I think we've touched on this one a little bit, back to the Ray Charles song. But here we want to think about this idea of engagement before knowledge, involving me and taking the time to reach out and say hello before you start doing the programming, before you start setting the content or the season or the programs. Just because you saw something come across the internet and you think that would be interesting to bring to my community, I think it's important here that we engage in conversations with as broad as possible a group. Now back to Seymour, Texas, where there are no African Americans or Latinos as permanent residents in that community. And one of the classroom teachers who was involved with the Arts Council there thought that it would be helpful for her students to view the film Scared Straight. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, where young men who have been incarcerated engage with other teenagers and say, if the life you want is to be locked up, then this is the life you should lead. Now, mind you, all the young people in her community are white, but there'd been some activities there that was concerning to the leadership of the community. And she said they need to watch this film. And when the kids were watching the film, it was perpetuating a stereotype that only Black men were incarcerated. And this is a group of all white teenagers. And when they debriefed the teenagers about the film, they said, you should have talked to us before you showed us this film. We wanted to have a conversation with you that we thought you were going to have that would help us think about other ways to spend our time besides the things that we've been doing, to get in trouble. And I thought about that, the damage of that lack of engagement before setting the content and the knowledge. And I ask you to pull that out in a bigger picture. You can bring the mariachi divas only if your community has talked about what that could mean for them and their interest in that. As arts leaders, sometimes we get a little pompous and we think my chamber music is so wonderful that everyone should want to experience it. And so I'm going to offer people free tickets to come to it. And again, that's not always the case. So engagement before setting the content, engagement before declaring that you know what the community wants. Thanks for asking is going to be the response that you get. Let's go to the next slide. The bottom line here is this. Inclusion has to happen before you can get to equity. Once you've gotten an idea that your audience feels equally involved, equally important in the decision-making and the design of the programming, then you can get to diversity. Inclusion comes before equity. Equity helps lead to diversity. And diversity, I think, is the desired state that we're all looking for.